Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. I'm Steve, and today we will be looking over the wide receiver position, learning through some analysis on it, some draft advice based on data from half PPR scoring, and everything is revolved around whatever a 12-team league is going to be the general advice that I give. This is the last positional video in a series, which is based on a series of articles that I wrote for each of the positions, which is available up on the website, www.theffforge.com. There is a link to the website down in the description. I have the charts, graphs, and spreadsheets for that you can see in that article. Those are also all available for non-PPR or standard scoring formats as well as full PPR formats. However, not all of it is available, and those are available for all patrons, regardless of the donation amount. I think it was the previous video. I wasn't sure if I would be able to set a donation. Well, it's probably 2 videos ago. Whatever the case, any donation amount gives you access to those, but I do want to just a heads up that it's going to be like the front portion of the analysis. I didn't end up being able to bring it all together to finish the articles, essentially. So if you want, there's also a link to the Patreon page down in the description below. Please don't forget to do the YouTube-y things. You know exactly what they are. Now, I would like to apologize for taking so long to get this video up, but some things came up. I prepared some other stuff ahead of time while I had time to be able to do that, and my cat was very unhealthy, was one of the things, so she is doing much better. All good. I managed to get together all of my rankings. Those are all uploaded on the website. Speaking of that, I am a dunce head and totally messed up uploading the running back stuff. I had it all prepared, and then I didn't click the publish button for all of it, or maybe that was the tight end. I don't know. I dunderheaded like twice, because then a couple of days later I realized that I didn't put like the links to those posts up on the website. So if you went onto the website to find those things, I definitely apologize that they weren't there. But I have all of the draft rankings up on the website already, as well as like printable cheat sheet, which, you know, with all of the positions available on that sheet, and then all the positions independently can be found also. I prefer to go off of having my positions independent from one another, so I use like 5 sheets of paper when I draft. But if you like to use my projections, those are all available. I don't know that I will upgrade the cheat sheet to my most recent rankings as those evolve. I already know some things that I want to probably change. I will probably change while I'm doing the video. We had a Zach Wilson just get injured, so may I move a couple guys back just a touch, maybe. And other than that, am I missing anything? Oh, also, I will be, before this video even gets edited, I will be recording all of the videos for those rankings too, so that way I can just start to pump out the videos, because we have reached that time. The drafts will be beginning soon. Some I'm sure are already done, but the bulk of them will be coming pretty quickly here. As far as today's video goes, the general structure will be broken down into 3 portions. Starting with just looking at the baseline of the data, I gathered each week's data, and I'll show that, and then what the averages were for at different ranks, etc. The floors and the ceilings, those kinds of numbers. And then the second thing I would go through is I would just quick run through how that information is transformed into season-long expectations of basically the tiers that a lot of the suggestions for drafting came down to for me. And also there will be a summary of the just any interesting nuggets that I found out about the position, any general profile on the position, and draft-specific advice. We will go to the shared screen shortly here. I'll move down like that. But prior to that, I missed out on something. Oh, there will be one more video in this series that will be the bringing all of this information together to try to figure out kind of where values may collide with other positions. I think I'm just going to kind of put that out there. I haven't had enough time to parse it out and come to too many suggestions off of it that I recall, but I will have that video coming out very shortly after this one, I'm sure, where you'll be able to... There's some interesting things in it, basically, is what I'm getting to, but I don't know how much actual advice I will directly say from it. Rock hard conclusions from it are a little tough to come by. So, other than that, this video will probably be crudely edited to just get rid of a lot of the waste. Right here in chart 1 is where everything started for this analysis. It is where I collected all of the weekly information for, the number 1, the number 6, the number 12, as it is shown on the screen there. Wide receivers information, what they scored each week of the season at those ranks of each week. And for the wide receiver analysis, we will be starting by looking at the skew, which is determined by looking at when the median scores fewer points than the average wide receiver of that rank. So, for the wide receiver 1, they scored 31.6 points for the median compared to 32.1 points for the average. That is fewer points, which means that the skew is to the right, because more weeks than not, they scored less than or towards fewer fantasy points than the average wide receiver 1 throughout the entirety of the season scored, which was 32.1 points. Now that you understand the skew for the front half of the position, the skew is consistently going off and to the right up until right around this point in the data. And for the back half of the position, the skew of the data is to the left, which means that everything is kind of pushing towards a central focus of those two skews, which appears to be at approximately the wide receiver 43 or 44. That would be around 8 fantasy points where that central focus for the entire position appears to be. And there also appear to be 2 bottlenecks, as I like to call them, within the position, and the first one at the front end of the position, not necessarily half, tends to be around the wide receiver 19 or 20 right in here, where we see everything evening out. At this point in the data, I'm thinking around 14 fantasy points could be a common higher end output that we will see for the position on a week in and week out basis, where a lot of players may end up scoring in a range around there that may include 14 fantasy points. The wide receiver 60 in the back half of the data tends to look like an area where we are seeing some bottlenecking of sorts, and that would be around the 4 to 6 fantasy point range from what I took away from this data. Something else that's very interesting to look at would be this ceiling here at wide receiver, the wide receiver 66 throughout the entirety of the season. The most fantasy points scored was 7.2 fantasy points, and here at the wide receiver 36, 7.3, essentially the same amount of fantasy points, was the floor. So you can see across these 30 positions, from 36 to 66, there is a floor and a ceiling that can meet. So if you score 7.5 fantasy points one week, you might be roughly a back-end flex wide receiver, or that wide receiver could have been, could have been like a wide receiver, 5-ish? So a lot of parity can be seen within the position from a week in and week out basis, is what I am getting at, especially in that area of the position. Think of it like this. A lot of guys got a short touchdown reception or a few catches for like 30 to 60 yards. That makes a lot of sense, I think, within the NFL. Or, one catch for, what would that be, 50, 60 something yards too. That just tends to be a fantasy point total that one way or another, a lot of wide receivers each and every week may end up scoring around. So now let's look at the weekly average expectations of output. Part of the process of turning that data into information that we can use for the draft looking forward and just to understand the positions is by trying to figure out more accurate expectations. Averages are merely that. They are just averages, and they can be quite misleading. So I did my best to nail down a range for what you can expect at roughly the rate of a coin flip or better was the standard that I set. And I called that the expected range, as you can see right here. ER, short for expected range. So the expected range of the wide receiver 1 in any given week across the season would be about 28 points to 36.5 points. For the wide receiver 6 at a rate of 50% or better, you could expect them to finish the week with about 19 to 21.5 fantasy points, seen right here. And you can go down the list and look at all of those. Once again, this is up on the website that you can look at these closer. So, among the skill positions, the wide receivers seemingly followed these and made them true at the highest rate, actually roughly a 60% rate for the position, meaning that these expected ranges are very reliable, more so than expected. And a lot of this analysis boils down to value. And just like we did with the expected ranges, that comes down to taking things one step further to delve deeper into what the data is telling us. And right here is one of the things that I really liked to look at to gauge value within the position from one rank to another. And that is the percent relative change. So from the wide receiver 1 to the wide receiver 6, you could expect that the wide receiver 6 scored at 37% fewer fantasy points relative to the wide receiver 1 in any given week on average throughout the season. So from 20.3 fantasy points, that is a 37% drop, or like the degradation is a word that I like to think of when looking at this, is how fast and how steep or quickly is the position degrading in its value. Another quick example of that would be from the wide receiver 6 to the wide receiver 12, you can expect the value to drop by 18% for the wide receiver 12's output in any given week relative to the wide receiver 6. Now, what we like to do is take things one step further to really delve into how we can take that information and move forward with it. That starts right here with Value Mountain in terms of those percent relative changes. And the best way to quickly understand this is that the wide receiver 1's output on average is 52% more valuable than the wide receiver 6's output, strictly within the bubble of the top 12 wide receivers on average. So these wide receivers, this output is 52% more valuable than comparing the wide receiver 6s to the wide receiver 12s. What kind of value you're getting there is going to be much less for the wide receiver 6. Then you can look down, and the wide receiver 6's output on average per week is 13% more valuable than the wide receiver 12's output within the bubble of the wide receiver 6 to the wide receiver 18. The amount of plateauing that we are seeing right here within this position is frankly insane and definitely unique compared to what we were seeing with Value Mountain at other positions. And even more fascinating is that the constant advantage that we are seeing here of 12% for the wide receiver 12, and then 2% for the wide receiver 18, and 9% for the wide receiver 24, those all withstood testing them to see if they were true, meaning that they turned out to be valid advantages at each at each pit stop within the position that I grabbed data from. That is important, a very important thing to understand. That will come back definitely when it comes time to making decisions on the advice that I gave for the wide receivers come draft time. And this is what we're seeing here with these advantages holding true, holding up to testing. That is was not the case for the running back position. Had this value not proven to be true, I do not know how the final advice for the position would look, but it would probably be closer to what I expected coming in, which essentially means, or would have been something along the lines of, there is very little urgency to get the next best wide receiver off the board throughout most of the draft. That's what I thought I was going to end up saying at the end of this video. We'll see if that is what I end up saying. Hint, hint. All of this information is based on weekly output throughout the season. In order to come to any advice, however, for draft day, we need to understand how regularly the individual receivers are scoring enough points to qualify as the wide receiver 12, for instance, in any given week. How often are they actually going to be giving you these types of advantages week in and week out? Because if, it's great if the wide receiver 1 gives you a 52% advantage over the wide receiver 6 in any given week. But if there's a different wide receiver 1 each and every single week of a season, then you can't rely on any single one of them to truly give you that advantage, would be the basic theory behind this. Also, in order to compare them to other positions as well as versus one another, we need to understand what kinds of advantages and disadvantages that one could expect across the season. In order to do that, all this data needs to be grouped into like sets of outcomes and then transformed. So let's take a very brief peek at how I went about that. And that begins here by creating these cloisters. So first, by taking in all of the patterns and trends and observations that I witnessed throughout the previous many pages of data that I looked through and created graphs and charts for that we are not going to be going over in this video, I just take all these observations that I come up with along the way, and then I am able to group individuals into groups, obviously, that have like weekly outcomes, and group them together, and then I called them cloisters because I'm cloistering set like groups of players together, or not even players, outcomes from the players together. These are not the outcomes of any one individual player. They are just like what we were looking at, the outcomes from the wide receiver 1 across the season and the wide receiver 6 across the season. It is a subjective process that as far as where I make these cutoffs here, but it is based on hard data, and here's what I came to for the wide receiver position. There are always hard decisions to make, and in the case of the wide receivers, the toughest areas where I had struggled there determining where to make some cutoffs were the same areas, those 3 areas that I mentioned at the beginning in the first chart that we looked at. So they were somewhere in the ranges of the wide receiver 20, 40, and 60, roughly. For most of the positions, or all of them maybe, I think all of them, I included a broader approach right at the bottom of these cloisters. For the wide receivers, that ended up looking like there is a top 5, a top 6 through 18 in one group, and then a 19 all the way up through the wide receiver 43 in another group, just showing you how once the position gets to a certain point, there is a lot of parity, and we've witnessed that in other spots through other data, which makes sense since this is based on the data. And then of course wide receivers 44 through 72 were the last section right down there. You can kind of see them sneaking in next to me. Just a quick sneak peek into the future, I can say that ultimately the advice does kind of break down into like 4 quadrants of talent, but kind of with a twist in regards to the draft day advice that I will give. We are getting close to that point, so let's continue this metamorphosis process, and the next step after this is to create tiers. And that begins just right below that, right around here is the beginning of that tier creation. And in the interest of brevity, I am not going to go through and look at my equalized value chart, which in other videos I have gone to around this point in these videos. The short of it is that each player's final equalized value, which is a system that I came up with from the 2021 season, then corresponds with whether they averaged in the range of, for instance, the wide receiver 12 or the wide receiver 18 or 36 across the entirety of the season. By taking the outcome of that, I am able to then place those players, their information, actually into the tiers that we're getting to here as a crystal ball of sorts. So by placing each of those players who averaged the wide receiver one wide receiver into the appropriate cloister, because if we were to go look at cloister 3 up here, we can see that that was for the average weekly wide receiver 5 to 11. So obviously 9 falls in that section. So I then place all the individuals into their appropriate cloisters, and then we eliminate some of the useless cloisters because there were no wide receivers that averaged in whatever those cloisters' weekly outcomes were. From that, we get our tiers. So as you can see, tier 1 is basically equal to cloister 3, which is basically equal to the wide receiver 9s. So that information from the wide receiver 9 is now plucked and just set right over into the tiers. I hope that didn't make a noise. And this is where everything comes together. The point from which we can start to make real conclusions on draft relevant information. Earlier I stated we needed to understand the scoring habits of wide receivers and the advantages or disadvantages that are available throughout the position, and this is how I did that. So that begins right here, where the scoring habits of the players from each group of equalized values can be seen. Then I use a weighted average to combine that information for the scoring habits of each tier, which can then be seen in Matrix 1.2, where we have our tiers. I'll just go back up here real quick. So if you look at this chart, the example I have down here is that the equalized value wide receiver 18s, which is Justin Jefferson and Deontay Johnson in 2021, scored within one standard deviation, which is 1.4 fantasy points, so plus or minus 14.1 fantasy points, which is what the average wide receiver 18 scored throughout the entirety of the 2021 season in 29% of their games. So Justin Jefferson, Deontay Johnson scored between, what would that be, 12.7 to 15.5 fantasy points in 29% of their games is essentially how to read this. And if you were to, hopefully I'll zoom in, I think it's going to be right about there is where you can see that on the chart. And then I combine, where there are multiple sets of players that all fit within the same tier, I use some weighted averaging to come to this chart, which is the easier one to use for bigger positions like this. Right off the bat, the color schemes can tell you a lot about the position and the individual tiers within the position. Recall the bottlenecking that I predicted around 14 fantasy points? That just so happens to fit right into Cloister 5 for the most part, and really borderline Cloister 4. All in all, when looking at the first 6 tiers, the draft relevant tiers at that, the players in 2021 scored within those 2 cloisters, Cloister 4 and Cloister 5, between 30 to 45% of their weeks. It is pretty obvious that the position scores within that range, which is technically 11 to 18 fantasy points a lot. For reference, I expect nearly 70 receivers to fulfill those top 6 tiers. So that is a lot of receivers scoring in that range often. I would call that a bottleneck. Cloister 8 and Cloister 9, right here, where you can see another piling up of green. Also, they represent the full range would be between 2.5 to 6.5 fantasy points for that back end bottleneck that I predicted. And these actually have a similar chance of occurring as the Cloister 5 and 4 did as far as that 40 to 30 to 45% chance. They have a similar chance to that. I think all but like 17 of the wide receivers roughly fit within these tiers and score between 2.5 to 6.5 fantasy points, that back end bottleneck, at a rate of 30 to 45, or like 1 in 3 games to nearly half of their games, depending on exactly which tier you're looking at. Which means between like 60 to 90% of the weeks, you can expect all wide receivers to score within one of those 2 fantasy point ranges. But here's a more edible way to take in that data. So I just kind of looked at what's an upper expectation that is gives you a really, really good advantage, and then kind of still a top 1 type back end, maybe 1 type week within the position. So that was 16 points, and the best of the best weeks, so like 28 plus points is kind of that floor for a really, really good week. And then also looking at what is like where it's going to start to be a bad week. Usually I like to think of that as 8 fantasy points or less tends to be a bad week. So that's where I made that cutoff as closely as I could for most of these positions. The tier 1 wide receiver, but in the future it could be multiple wide receivers we would project to be a tier 1 wide receiver. They averaged 28 plus fantasy points in roughly 5 games a season, 16 plus in roughly 9 games a season, and you would not expect them to have like that bad week. So let's call it a great week, a good week, and a bad week. As far as the second tier goes, they had the same odds roughly of having a great week, but their good weeks fell off. So they kept that high ceiling with the tier 2 wide receivers 2 and 3 in 2021. But their good weeks, their 16 plus point weeks, fell off a little bit, and you could almost expect to have a bad week from these guys. So basically one of them had a week where they scored 8 fantasy points or less between the 2 that input was put into that tier 2 data. For tier 3, you could expect a great game roughly once a season. In comparison to tier 2, you could expect some good weeks at about the same rate for 5 games a season, and bad games all of a sudden shoots up by 80% or whatever, or 500%. I don't know. 2.5 games compared to a half a game. So between 2 to 3 games, you can expect to have kind of a bad week from. That's really starting at wide receiver 4, going back to roughly wide receiver, I think it's 17, right? And of course, within the tier from the front to the back, things change, but when we're projecting forward, we're lumping them all in together. Then looking at the 4th tier, it's going to look similar as far as continuing to hold up that ceiling, only their good games start to drop, and still continuously the floor drops out, and a lot of wide receiver 2s and flex wide receivers are going to have bad weeks, roughly 6 games a season. And then tier 4, tier 5, you start to see things fall out. You can look at these all on your own. Not a heck of a lot worse than tier 4, but definitely significantly worse across the board. So the next thing that we wanted to look at was Matrix 2.1. The advantages and the disadvantages, I said, would be important via the equalized values is going to be right here, 2.1. But just like with Matrix 1.1, we take the weighted averages of things here, and we get Matrix 2.2, which is the tiered advantage/disadvantage matrix. Here's how you read it. Tier 1 wide receivers, on average, you could expect them to have an 11% advantage over a tier 2 wide receiver on any given week. So going into week 3, you have Cooper Kupp last season, and you're facing up against Justin Jefferson, let's say. You could still expect to beat Justin Jefferson by 11% or by 2.6 fantasy points. That is how you end up reading this chart. And then, of course, moving forward, you're taking the names out of there, and we're just saying that a tier 1 wide receiver gives you that kind of expected advantage on average throughout the season. or in any given week, however you want to think about that. Now, what I did here is I broke down the overall advantages across versus the field as well as versus starters, and you can see the difference between the starters by this thickened black line here. So I like to look at that as like the season-long expected advantages versus the field, whereas the weekly advantages, or like most weeks, your advantages would be against the guys within these top 5 tiers. That's, you're going to see those wide receivers most often because they are the most reliable wide receivers, the bigger name wide receivers for reasons. But doesn't mean you don't see these tier 6, tier 7 wide receivers some weeks. It definitely happens, especially, of course, in a bigger league. All in all, there are 31 wide receivers who offer a season-long benefit to your team. So that would be these top 4 tiers. I did not include tier 5 because that is just so close to being a neutral season-long player where they're not giving you any kind of advantage or disadvantage across the entirety of a season. But there are only 3 wide receivers who actually give you a weekly expected advantage, tiers 1 and tier 2. As you can see, we start to get less than 1 point here at the tier 3 wide receivers. However, I would guesstimate that there are, maybe 2 to 7 more wide receivers where you would really trust that they could give you some sort of weekly advantage against any competition. You could expect them to beat most, wide receivers are going to be going up against for your opponent's wide receiver. Basically, they're reliable enough, like between 5 to 10 wide receivers in total, I would guesstimate, give you reliable advantages on a week in and week out basis. In the last portion of the analysis, I went through and looked at the health of the position along with the consistency of the position, both in a few different ways. I do have consistency ratings charts that are available, and just like the quarterbacks, based on the analysis, I do believe that consistency rules the wide receiver position. So if you're someone who likes consistency ratings to help develop your draft day targets, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm giving you the green light to do so. Go ahead, look at whatever consistency ratings you want to use and start to, push up a guy who rates highly for good consistency on a week in and week out basis, and go ahead and dock, a few Tyler Lockett's of past season type guys who aren't so consistent, because according to my analysis, those consistent guys are going to give you an advantage that is tangible across the entirety of the season compared to the boom or bust kinds of guys. And just a little FYI, there was zero doubt as far as that conclusion goes that consistency does matter for the wide receiver position. One last thing before we begin the conclusions on the position is the draft day quick files on here. Right here, I dropped that 7th tier because there's I want to say roughly 90 something wide receivers in these first 6 tiers. 31, 40, 54, 69, 72. 72 wide receivers that I think on draft day you can target and expect something good from, essentially. If there's anything that you can just take away from this analysis and implement it right in, is just grab these draft day quick files and they'll give you an idea at least of what kind of advantages and disadvantages you could get across the position. It's a lot of the information that we just went through, but put in a short little quick snippet of info. The main thing that I wanted to point out for the draft day quick tiers is this attack early or lay back on draft day portion. This is most specifically based on Value Mountain and is speaking on any wide receiver or wide receivers or players, whatever, within the position that are within that specific tier. So basically, the value is there for the number 1 wide receiver based on even how they averaged across the season. You want the number 1 wide receiver. And I do believe that a lot of years there is that one wide receiver that just goes off and has a season. And are, well and above clearly the best wide receiver for fantasy football that season. Then we look at tier 2 and it says layback technically, because obviously it's going to be pretty rare where you're going to be in a position where the second best and third best wide receiver are both available, and you feel confident that you could not take a wide receiver and one of those two would still be there. But it does happen where, especially like in a 10-team league, I would say probably more likely that you might have that ninth pick. One person picking 2 picks in between you may or may not take those 2 wide receivers, so you risk it, and then you get that third best wide receiver on your list. Well, by the value, that's actually who you wanted to take, and whoever you took with your ninth pick may have gotten you better value elsewhere than let's say the fifth running back, or it'll be. You get what I'm saying. Maybe. Shit. What did I do? So the idea is that you can sit back here. That's all. And then we go into the third tier, and it's saying to attack the bookend. So attack early, attack late within the tier at tier 3. So maybe those first 5-ish wide receivers or so are definitely worth targeting. They have the value is there. And then there's going to be a few wide receivers where you can go attack a different position and wait off on them. But that doesn't mean, you still want this tier over this tier no matter what, even if it says layback. But definitely worth attacking late third tier, and that trend continues through this fourth tier, where you're still going to be wanting to get the very next wide receiver off of the board. And then at tier 5, we see a little pocket where it's okay to lay back. So if you get through those first 30-ish wide receivers, then there's going to be a pocket of 4 or 5 wide receivers where you don't necessarily need to attack them if you expect somebody else within that tier to still be there for your next pick. Generally, how to think of that. And then tier 6 is going to be attack again, and I think I will go over this again shortly, but in general, the advice is just to attack. All right, quick looking at the health and consistency of the position. I believe I would have just went over some of the consistency, but in regards to the health of the position, roughly 13 games are played on average by any given wide receiver. That number, as well as these next numbers, which will be a range, it tends to get better as you get to the more exclusive group of like the top 17 wide receivers compared to a group of the top 50 or 100. Continuously, the numbers tend to favor the better wide receivers more. So expect 13 games or more for your wide receivers, for starting level wide receivers. And then as far as every position I've looked at, what percentage of them actually play in all 16 of the games that they should be available for you in fantasy football, or are only injured, only miss one game. So 15 or 16 games, and 50 to 60% of the times of the wide receivers actually played in all 16 or 15 of the weeks for the fantasy season. So that's, I believe, the best percentage of any position other than, like, obviously DSTs would be 100%. Kickers are pretty darn high, I believe. But the specialty positions and quarterbacks are going to be pretty high. I don't remember where that ranks versus them. But anyways, pretty healthy overall. Not too bad there. Though there was no bonus analysis in this video like I've had in the analysis that I did, like I did with other positions due to some time constraints, and it just didn't feel necessary because wide receiver conclusions were surprisingly straightforward, the exact opposite of what I expected there to be. So we're going to stick to the KISS method for this position. Perfect. Love it. Let's go. Despite there being a lot of parity across the entirety of the position, both on a weekly basis and at a season-long scale, the simplest draft advice that I can give you is to attack the position. Primarily through those top 30 or so wide receivers, you really want to attack them. That's where you're going to get your advantages versus the other wide receivers on other leagues league mates teams teammate league mate it's teams. So you gain value and pure fantasy points across most of the position. There are small pockets. I should clarify that you will gain value and pure fantasy points across the position, like incrementally, because there is always going to be value and there's always going to be more fantasy points scored for the better wide receivers. If you watch the previous videos, that second part will make more sense, but regardless, the next best wide receiver off the board is always going to be the wide receiver that you want in general. But there are small little pockets that that's not necessarily the case, but where you could like sit back at the position with. But that's really only if the board allows it. So think of it like this. Roughly wide receiver 10 to 12 or so would be one of those small pockets that if you are drafting like around a turn, you could actively target another position, knowing that, 1, 2, 3 wide receivers are going to get taken, maybe ones that you kind of liked, but are within that same tier there. And that you would be just as happy value-wise in a better spot based on getting that 12th or 13th wide receiver off of the board. So there's a small little pocket there at the back of the top-end wide receivers where you really don't need to be urgently pushing to get one of those, the 9th, 10th, 11th wide receiver off of the board. Then after the top 30-ish wide receivers are off of the board, there is also no need to attack the front of whatever tier you have starting around there. So think of it like this. If whatever data that you're using has like 35 wide receivers in the first, 3 tiers or something, then at that 4th tier, once you hit wide receiver 36, you can kind of lay back on some of the first, let's say, 6 or so wide receivers in that next tier. No urgency to get them. The value's just not really there at that little pocket of the position. So the keep it simple, stupid advice would be to get them when you can. That's it. Just keep in mind that the advantages at the position are at a minimum, and even though they are relevant advantages, it's still just not always huge advantages. So I'm not trying to tell you to be going and drafting the 5 wide receivers in the first 5 rounds of your draft. That's not the advice. Plus, drafting gems and, getting busts are always a thing. So, the draft doesn't end up representing the final standings at the end of the year. What I'm going to go through right now is the general strategy that I plan to have on my mind for the wide receiver position in terms of like a best case scenario for the position. I have 2 routes you could go. The first one is the actual best case scenario, and then the second is more taken into account if you don't want to go with a wide receiver at your first pick, or if you're picking in a different spot of the draft, that things just dictate the best case scenario for wide receivers wouldn't be the best case scenario for, the draft based on what's available when you're picking. So, in the best of worlds, for the wide receiver position, if I could, stack a top 3 wide receiver with a top 10 wide receiver and a top 24 wide receiver, that should give me reliable weekly advantages when all 3 of them are healthy, from, my wide receiver 1 giving me an advantage over my opponent's wide receiver 1, my wide receiver 2 give me advantage over most of my opponent's wide receiver 2s, and my wide receiver 3 giving me an advantage over most of my opponent's wide receiver 3s, back end, flex, whatever, wide receivers, to a point where they're also giving me a reliable advantage. I can flip a coin, or most weeks I can just expect that they are going to beat my opponents equal to them on their roster. So going directly off of ADPs from Fantasy Pros, pretend that you have the 6th pick in the draft, and this is what that might look like. You could get Justin Jefferson with your 1st pick, Deebo Samuel with your 2nd pick, or T. Higgins in the 3rd round instead, and go with a different position with your 2nd pick. And either way, you're still getting a top 10 type wide receiver, or at least close to. Don't recall at the top of my head. And then Marquis Brown, you could take in the 5th round. So in the 4th round, with going based on the strategy, that's definitely open to get a different position. That's like a little spot where you don't have to worry about drafting wide receiver at all. And then, so in the 5th round, you could take Marquis Brown, or you could take a different position and go with Allen Robinson in the 6th round, and you're still going to be in that top 24 wide receiver range, roughly, depending exactly how the draft goes. And I actually did a couple of mock drafts that we'll be getting to very shortly, but just looking at ADPs, if you were to go this route to get that top 3, top 10, and top 24 wide receiver on your team, you could still attack and get a Mark Andrews or a Josh Allen or an Alvin Kamara in the 2nd round probably. Or you could get like a Mahomes, a Herbert, Kyle Pitts, Ezekiel Elliott with your 3rd round for some examples. And also, you could still get like a Herbert, Lamar Jackson, George Kittle, Darren Waller, or like a top 22 running back in the 4th round. And I believe I said top 22 for a reason, as far as our analysis based on the top running backs, but maybe not. Maybe that was just literally the ADP that would be available if you had the 6th pick in the 4th round. Either way, Elijah Mitchell is like a guy that in the 5th round that you could get on your team. Another route that you could go with, still following true to this strategy, would be to take 3 running backs from the 3rd to the 5th round. So you go wide receiver, running back, wide receiver in the 6th round. Boom. You got a bunch of early round running backs to hopefully plug and play 2 of them. You'll get your quarterback later, you get your tight end later, like a lot of people would suggest anyways for those positions, and you follow that general wide receiver strategy there. Whatever the case, I was simply trying to implement what I know about the other positions off of the top of my head, so that is why I had those wide receivers and quarterbacks and tight ends listed, because you can nab up some of those top tier guys that will give you a value advantage, because that value is there for those guys based on the analysis within their own positions. The 2nd route you could go, if that route doesn't work for your draft position, for how your draft is going, whatever the case, if you wanted to go stronger at running back, or like I said, you're not drafting at the number 6 position, you can. My advice would be to be sure to strike at one of the top 18, right around the wide receiver 18. Make sure to strike right in that range when you get that chance. And also, I would aim to get the 2 of the top 30 guys as well on your team, just to round out that spot on your roster. Based on current ADPs, this could be done by drafting your wide receivers in the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds. So that's not that hard to do, to still get 2 top 30 guys and the 18th wide receiver. So you can see right there at that 15th and the 5th round, obviously there starts to be a run on wide receivers that occurs, considering you go 5 rounds roughly to get to about the wide receiver 18, and then all of a sudden by the 7th round, or at least by the time that you would be coming back on the 8th round, you've gone past the top 30 running backs. Well, I don't know how much of a run that is. Whatever. So after workshopping those 2 bits of advice out, and based on current ADPs, which was based on current ADPs, if you are comfortable with some of the mid-round running backs, then I think that you end up with very similar looking rosters or squads in both of those scenarios, except in that first scenario, when you're actually attacking the position, you end up with, much higher projected wide receivers, which have a higher chance of doing what you drafted them to do. Obviously, they're expected to be better, and we're good enough at projecting these types of things that they do have a higher chance at working out and being a better wide receiver than somebody taken after him, generally speaking. So my advice would be to go with that first thing that I said. And I decided to take that first option for a spin. And I got the 7th pick. It just did random trying to find one of those middle spots. Ended up with the 7th pick in a Fantasy Pros mock draft. And here's how that draft went. Quick note, I did not use my own rankings, as at the time of doing this, they were not finished anyways. And I largely wanted to use consensus, as it is a good base to work from for some sort of expectation of what you can expect in a draft, who you can expect to be available around that spot. So just use consensus. Not the best thing in the world, but also a good base to work from. So trying to get a top 3, a top 18, and a top 30 wide receiver. Here's how it went. I got Jamar Chase with my first round pick at pick 7, and then I got Mark Andrews in round 2, Keenan Allen in round 3, and then Justin Herbert in round 4. Followed by, I took Josh Jacobs with my 5th round pick, which left Jerry Jeudy and Michael Thomas were out on the board. The two names that I thought were giving me some hesitation. And I think Michael Thomas, now for me, I've changed my viewpoints on him enough that I would almost surely want him higher than Josh Jacobs. But with only other one running back being taken between this pick and my 6th round pick, if that is the expectation, then I would probably definitely go for the wide receiver with that 5th pick. But, I got nervous with what was left with the running backs there at the 5th round, and I was like, I gotta attack one. So that left me with Darnell Mooney in the 6th round. Still a super solid wide receiver 3. He was definitely a wide receiver 2, I want to say, last season. So nothing wrong with getting him there. And then in the 7th round, I took Kenneth Walker, who I did have to go down the board a ways to get, but so I tried sticking mostly to the next best guy on the board, but especially as the rounds go on a little bit, went down. So took Kenneth Walker there in the 7th. I think that I would be fine with him being he should be a starting running back, getting the majority of his team's carries, which most of them are viable in fantasy land if they're getting a large percentage of their team's carries. And they're the starter. Duh. Going on to the 8th round, I got Devonta Smith. I was going to go running back, but I did not love the immediate options that I was seeing on the table there. So I figured, why not take a chance at just getting another stud? He's a high risk, high reward kind of wide receiver. Don't know how that's going to work out. It's an interesting offense this season for fantasy reasons. Should be pretty good in real life for sure. And then with rounds 9 and 10, I took James Cook, which is Buffalo's new rookie running back, and Alexander Mattison. I will probably have Dameon Pierce higher on my board than Alexander Mattison, but I did not see him actually, I think, when I did this draft, so I think that's why I wanted to bring that up. And then also in regards to James Cook, he will probably be higher or lower, just dependent on the current news cycle going throughout the season. He has a large range of outcomes depending on what the team decides to do and how much we know or think that we know about what the expectations are with that running back core. But just as far as Buffalo goes, they've gotten some pretty good efficient play from Zach Moss, and prior to that, why can't I think of his name? Whatever. They keep drafting these running backs, and they seem to not be happy with them for whatever reason. So I think that James Cook is going to get a shot to carry the load. They did seem to learn about halfway through last season that they needed to run a little bit more to be a more threatening offense overall. And so I think that is a good spot to be in if what I think is going to happen turns to be true. So Anyways, moving on. Round 11 was Christian Watson. Had to go down the board for that. I totally understand why. Replace him with whoever you want. I think whoever you think is the number one number one fantasy wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers at the 11th in the 11th round. Take him. Why not? It's worth it. It's my 5th wide receiver on this team. And then with the 12th round, I went ahead and I took the number 2 DST. In the 13th round, I got Zamir White, which would be insurance for my number 1 running back. I do believe that he will be the backup to Josh Jacobs. They have a stable of running backs there, but a lot of them are like the receiving James White role type running backs, and I don't think that they want to start one of those running backs as their primary running back. So I think if Josh Jacobs were to go down, Zamir White is the guy who comes in and replaces him, and he can catch the ball just fine. So I liked him as a prospect. Yeah, how true that ends up being or not, I don't know. Follow the news on that one as the preseason goes along. And then with the 14th pick, got the number 3 kicker off of the board. And with the 15th pick, I took Pierre Strong. This was before James White retired because I fully expected him to take whatever James White's role, whatever is left of James White's role in that offense. I expected him to take that over. There's new offensive play calling going on there, so things could change philosophically to some extent. But either way, I have some wiggle room on that roster with those late picks to go ahead and pick up other guys if those players aren't what I thought at the time of this draft. Fantasy pros did hate this draft, and I understand why, but past me would have hated it too. But I would be fine going to battle with this roster and just keep my eyes open for those running back injuries and pick up from there if nothing else. And I ended up doing a second try a lot quicker than that one. I won't give so much analysis on it, but here was my second go with that same ideology mindset there. Justin Jefferson with the first round pick, Travis Kelce with the second round pick, Michael Pittman with the third round pick, Kyler Murray or Lamar Jackson. Either was available there with the 5th round, 4th round, and then Elijah Mitchell, followed by Gabriel Davis for the 3rd wide receiver on that team, and then Damian Harris for the RB2, Kareem Hunt. This was before he announced he wanted to trade. We'll see how that goes. And then Christian Kirk a little bit later, high upside, I think, 2 kind of guy. Kadarius Toney next. Now, I don't think I would... I don't know, I'd have to see the board. I think I like the rookie actually more with my rankings than Kadarius Toney for this coming season, but definitely an exciting player, worth being drafted at some point by some team. And then follow that up by Raheem Mostert, the number 3 DST, and then DJ Shark, Zamir White, the number 3 kicker, and Pierre Strong yet again to finish up the draft. So in that case, running backs would be Elijah Mitchell, Kareem Hunt, Damian Harris, Raheem Mostert. I'm not so sure about that one anymore, but I was once again trying to stick mostly in line with what Fantasy Pros was, what the consensus was for the next best running back, and then Zamir White again because I do like him, and Pierre Strong. So number 3 DST, number 3 kicker. I think the number 1 wide receiver, Michael Pittman, Gabriel Davis, Christian Kirk, Kadarius Toney, some guys there, DJ Shark. So, anyways, I liked the first roster more. Fantasy Pros liked that roster a lot more, but I would probably, even though I like that first roster more, this is a little confusing, but I would probably feel more comfortable with this second roster. Just kind of some of those names we know what they are, and that running back 2 I think is more solid on this. It feels more solid with that second line up here. Couple last bits that I have that I think are important to keep in mind. Number one, for wide receivers, injuries do not often birth a new waiver wire wide receiver out of the blue. Most often, what happens when a wide receiver gets injured is that it shifts the team dynamics and opportunities for the players who are most often already among the starting players. It is fairly not incredibly common for an injury to directly birth a replacement like running back tends to happen even too at the running back position. So usually what I do is I just raise the other starters who oftentimes aren't going to be available, tend to, maybe they'll get another target or two, depending on who got injured, whatnot, and the team, and a lot of factors. And the second little last tidbit here is that, early on in the season tends to be the best time to attack the waiver wire for wide receivers. And then oftentimes mid to late season, you can expect one or two rookies to come into their own. So I think after week 3 to like week 8-ish is not really a great time to be finding good wide receiver talent usually out there on the waiver wires. So, be ready early on in the season, and then also keep your eyes open for some of those guys who start to get opportunities around week 5, 6 of the season and are doing something with those opportunities. Maybe get ahead of the, if you have the ability to, maybe get ahead of the curve there. I'll be here to help you out with finding some of those guys. And other than that, peace out. Thank you. I love you. Good night. Goodbye. Peace out. I said that already. Bye.